I knew that this time would come, where you realize how old a game is until you see a number big enough to make you think, geez, it's been that long ago now? To be honest, I can't remember a lot of what happened in 2003, but I remembered this game like it was yesterday. Need for Speed Underground is one of those racing games immortalized by what it's accomplished for the franchise, as well as the people like me who grew up with it, and those new to the series discovering it, only to end up loving it. Need for Speed nowadays is back on the streets, but is no longer the same, quite literally from the moment that you begin making a turn where everything for some reason turns into a drift. Underground, however, represented pure arcade fun in 2000s fashion, with a level of handling that hasn't been matched by any other franchise. The atmosphere, the city lights and the cars with neons underneath created the perfect storm that took over during the early 2000s, where people became obsessed with the Fast and the Furious movies, seeing the souped up Supras and Skylines, RX-7s, Honda Civics, S2000s, you name it. These JDM machines were even cooler than they already were, thanks to the presentation of the early Fast and the Furious movies and the early Need for Speed Underground racing games like Underground 1 and onward. Black Box and EA saw the craze and decided to make this wet dream come true in the guise of a game where we could have our own JDMs, our own RX-7s, 350 SEDs, Supras, Celicas, Skylines, or the VTEC that kicked in, you name it, like I already said. The game was and still is a JDM paradise, born in a time capsule that's been gone for a very long time now, and while I'm happy that Need for Speed has returned to the street racing scene, I also have my own gripes with them on a technical level. I had already covered Need for Speed Underground before, but since it's now reaching its 20-year mark as of this week, I thought I would make a celebratory kind of video on the matter of this game that is now reaching 20 years old, which is just nuts, honestly. And it's still, 20 years later, one of the greatest racing games of all time. And the game that, in my opinion, really got the franchise going. Racing games, as they are today, is in a binary situation. In mainstream terms, anyways. It's either a full-on racing sim or an arcade sim. Something that you would see in Forza Horizon, for instance. But there was a time when arcade races were the norm. Games like Midnight Club, Burnout, and Need for Speed. These three games were like the holy trinity in this case. Need for Speed, though, is now the only one out of the three holding the torch still. And the other games, they haven't had a sequel in like forever. And the older games in the Need for Speed franchise still seem to be the shining examples. The graphics have gotten better now, though. The car variety and the customization is also in a great spot too. But the gameplay is something that just isn't that good. It just misses the mark in some departments. And the fact that people go back to the earlier Need for Speed titles like Underground 1 and 2 really just says a lot about what's missing, you know? And it's this perfect balance and harmony that Underground 1 had established in its driving and handling that for some reason was just never replicated in the Ghost entries. Black Box themselves had consistently created a nice blend of arcade racing with a good level of momentum in Underground 1, while still creating a believable sense of turning without the on-rails approach that then turns into a drift like you see in 2015 or Payback or Heat or Unbound. The cutscenes in Underground, while endearing, haven't aged that well. Very CGI 2000s like, but on the flip side, they are memorable. Underground 1 doesn't have that many cutscenes, but each one represented a stage of the player moving up in the scene, evolving from being a wannabe racer that was having wet dreams of the Honda Integra to being the king of the hill at the very end. You go through a gauntlet of races of different kinds, moving up the ranks and upgrading a car so that you could get a shot at the brown Skyline sitting at the throne. The game wasn't about a personal or political agenda, but just pure racing. People living for the opportunity to come out on top with their souped up rides, scoring the most drift points or racing the straight line and drag, doing laps or a sprint in Olympic City. Need for Speed Underground feels focused with its goals, and you aren't put on a pedestal like you are in Forza Horizon, where it feels like everyone's doing everything for your sake. In Underground 1, you keep your opponents in your rear view. No wins means no cool parts. It's that simple, and it's part of what made this game awesome. You had to work for your rewards. The standards for cars have changed today, but the love for JDMs has never left, and this game embraces that same feeling that was still there in the 2000s. Need for Speed Underground was the game I played a lot of on the Xbox, the original one, whereas with my brother, it was Halo. Eventually, though, the Sony fanboy in me placed a slice of cheese inside the console, ruining it forever, and I would continue to enjoy the game still on the PS2 and eventually the PC. And you know what? Need for Speed Underground was still awesome even after all these years of playing it on and off. Like, every time I played it, I had gotten the same feeling as I did when I was a kid. I loved it back then and I still love it now. I've played a ton of games where the rose-colored nostalgia glasses hides the actual truth of titles that are revered but aren't really that good as people remember them to be. Need for Speed Underground, though, on the other hand, doesn't really have that problem, though. Sure, you can notice more of the issues now as you've grown up, but at the end of the day, it's still a great racing game with some fun handling, driving, a good sense of atmosphere, decent customization, a good selection of cars, a pretty straightforward storyline to boot. Some of the annoying aspects, like the annoying traffic, the random traffic that is, that can sometimes screw up your races, especially in drag. The wonky collision with some of the objects and the curbs on the roads, it still isn't enough to waver the overall experience. And the soundtrack is still amazing, something that is just as hard to balance out as is creating a compositional soundtrack for a game. The tracks themselves reflect the time period and the nighttime racing setting perfectly, with a good variety of different genres mixed in. The most important thing to take from Underground is that it really was just a game. It didn't need a message to be good or engage in other topics that didn't have four wheels. Need for Speed Underground just gives you a car and it makes you want to win. And on that note, happy 20th anniversary, Need for Speed Underground. The game with amazing arcade handling, great pool of JDM cars, with decent customization like I've said, good variety of race modes, even drag, and a straightforward campaign that from beginning to end has a good sense of progression where it feels like, the races get progressively harder, and faster, but so does your car. Also, the modding scene on the side is something to also appreciate, coming in with some cool shaders or even some car reskins so that you have new wheels to go first place in. Nowadays, arcade races are somewhat still around, but in a smaller indie level capacity where developers have tried to bring back the old school style of arcade racing, whether it's something from way back in like the 80s or 90s or 2000s, which is like for me the melting pot of the arcade racing scene. And emulation has also made it possible to discover other criminally underrated racing games like Tokyo Extreme Racer and Auto Modellista. But I'm still waiting for the day someone tries to recreate Underground's handling and sense of driving, or even its atmosphere at least. 2015 is one game that I think is the closest to that sense, the nighttime feeling that you sort of get in Underground 1. Too bad the handling is dog shit. But until then though, if you can find a copy of this legendary game and you want a more arcadey feel to your racing game, then this should be your first stop. Or if you're new to the Need for Speed franchise and you don't mind rewinding the clock, then this should be the game that you start with. But if you can't keep up, then here's some cash. Get a cab. You'll get home faster.
Yo, taxi!